The Winchester rifle balanced across Fiona Johnson's lap gleamed in the late afternoon sun. As she sat on the porch of her small homestead outside Utica, Montana, watching the horizon for riders who would never come. It was the summer of 1881, and the land stretched out before her in endless waves of golden grass that rippled like water in the hot breeze. 3 years had passed since she'd buried her father on the hill behind the cabin, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross that weathered with each passing season. 3 years of working this land alone, of proving to everyone in town that she didn't need their pity or their help. She'd learned to shoot straight, to mend fences, to break horses, and to keep her heart as guarded as her property line. The sound of hoofbeats made her straighten, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle. A lone rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the sinking sun. Fiona stood slowly, her boots making soft sounds on the worn wooden planks. She was 22 years old, tall and lean from hard work. With dark auburn hair she kept braided down her back and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Her face had lost the soft roundness of girlhood, replaced by sharper angles that spoke of too many meals skipped and too many nights sleeping light in case of trouble. The rider came closer, and she could make out more details. A man, broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. He wore dusty trail clothes and a weathered hat pulled low against the sun. As he approached the boundary of her property, he slowed his horse to a walk, raising one hand in greeting. "Far enough," Fiona called out, her voice carrying clear across the distance. She didn't raise the rifle, but her stance made it clear she could if needed. The rider stopped, still a respectful distance away. "Meaning no trouble, madam. Just looking for work and heard in town there might be a spread out this way. You heard wrong. I'm not hiring." The man pushed his hat back slightly, and she could see his face more clearly now. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. There was something about the way he sat his horse, patient and unhurried, that marked him as different from the usual drifters who came through looking for easy money or easier prey. "Respectfully, madam, your north fence is down in 3 places. Your well rope is frayed near to breaking, and unless I miss my guess, that barn roof won't make it through another winter." His voice was deep and steady, with a hint of something that might have been humor. "Not saying you need help, just saying the work needs doing." Fiona felt heat rise to her face, anger mixing with embarrassment because he was right about all of it. She'd been putting off those repairs, choosing instead to focus on the day-to-day necessities of keeping her small herd of cattle fed and her garden producing enough to see her through the winter. "I don't recall asking for your opinion on my property." "No, madam, you surely did not." He shifted in his saddle, and his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stamped one hoof. "Name's Thomas Wyatt. I'm handy with tools and livestock. I don't drink to excess, and I work for fair wages. I could do those repairs in exchange for meals and a place to sleep in your barn." "No need for cash money if you're short." "I'm not short," Fiona said quickly, though her pride spoke louder than truth. "And I'm not looking for help. I manage just fine on my own." Thomas Wyatt studied her for a long moment, his eyes traveling from her defensive stance to the rifle, to the cabin behind her with its patched roof, and the corral where her 3 horses stood watching. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, lacking any trace of judgment. "I'm sure you do, madam. I'm sure you do." He gathered his reins, preparing to turn his horse. But managing alone and thriving are 2 different things. Town's a long ride back, and I'd be grateful for the chance to water my horse before I head out if you'd allow it. Something in his words struck deeper than Fiona wanted to admit. She'd been managing, surviving, proving her point day after day that she didn't need anyone. But thriving, that was a word she'd almost forgotten. She looked at him again, really looked this time, and saw the dust of many miles on his clothes, the way his horse's head drooped slightly with tiredness, the honest weariness in the set of his shoulders. "Water's in the trough by the barn," she said finally, her grip on the rifle loosening slightly. "Then you move along." Thomas Wyatt touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged, madam." She watched as he rode slowly toward the barn, noting the way he kept his movements predictable and non-threatening. Her dog, a mixed-breed shepherd named Bear who'd been lying in the shade, lifted his head and watched the stranger approach. To Fiona's surprise, Bear's tail began to wag slowly, and he stood to investigate the newcomer rather than bark a warning. Fiona descended from the porch, still carrying the rifle but letting it rest more casually in the crook of her arm. She followed at a distance as Thomas dismounted by the water trough, letting his horse drink deeply. He pulled off his hat, dunking his head briefly in the cool water, then straightening and running his wet hands through his hair. Water droplets caught the late sunlight as they fell from his dark curls. Bear had approached him now, and Thomas crouched down, letting the dog sniff his hand before scratching behind his ears. "Good boy," he said quietly. "You take good care of her, do you?" "He does," Fiona said, closer now. "He's a better judge of character than I am." Thomas looked up at her, and she saw amusement in his dark eyes. "Then I'm honored to pass his inspection. Don't let it go to your head. He also likes rabbits and will chase them until he forgets where home is." That earned her a genuine smile, transforming his face from merely pleasant to something that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. She turned away, focusing on his horse instead. "You've ridden him hard today." "We've been on the trail for near on 2 weeks. Came up from Wyoming looking for a place to settle down and do honest work." Thomas stood, replacing his hat. "I'm not a drifter by nature, Miss Johnson, Fiona Johnson." She didn't know why she gave him her first name. She usually kept to formalities with strangers. "And it's not Miss anything. Just Johnson will do." "Miss Johnson, then," Thomas said, with a slight emphasis that suggested gentle teasing. "I mean what I said about the work. I could have those repairs done in a few days, and you wouldn't have to pay me more than food and a dry place to sleep. I've got my own bedroll and gear." Fiona wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being, every defense she'd built up over 3 long years, told her to send him on his way. She'd made it this far without help, without depending on anyone. But as she looked around at her property, seeing it through his eyes, she couldn't deny the truth of his words. The fence was down. The well rope was dangerous. The barn roof was a patchwork of repairs that wouldn't hold through another Montana winter. "Why?" she asked abruptly. "Why offer to work for so little? You could get better wages in town or at one of the bigger spreads." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on his horse's neck. "I know what it's like to try to do everything alone, to prove you can. After my father died, I ran our place in Wyoming by myself for near on 2 years before I admitted I was running it into the ground out of sheer stubbornness." He met her eyes directly. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't doing it alone. It's knowing when to accept a hand offered in good faith." His words hit too close to home, touching on fears she barely acknowledged to herself. Fiona looked away, her jaw tight. "I don't need lectures about bravery. I've been doing just fine." "Yes, madam, I can see that. You've done more than most could manage." His tone held no condescension, only respect. "But fine and good are different things, and you deserve good." Fiona felt something crack in her chest, some small fissure in the wall she'd built around herself. She'd become so accustomed to fighting, to defending, to proving, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply acknowledge her efforts without trying to diminish them or take over. 3 days, she heard herself say. You can stay 3 days, fix what needs fixing. You sleep in the barn, you don't come to the house unless invited, and you're gone at the end of it. Those are the terms. Thomas nodded slowly. Those are fair terms, I accept. Good. Fiona shifted the rifle to her other arm, suddenly feeling awkward. I'll bring supper out to the barn around sunset. There's a clean stall at the north end where you can lay out your bedroll. I'm grateful, Miss Johnson. Thomas began to unsaddle his horse, and Fiona noticed how gently he handled the animal, checking its hooves and running his hands down its legs to check for injuries or swelling. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, aware of Bear trotting along beside her, and equally aware that the dog kept looking back at the stranger in the barn. Traitor, she thought, but without any real heat behind it. Inside the cabin, Fiona leaned the rifle against the wall by the door and moved to the small kitchen area. The single room served as her living space, with a bed in one corner, a table and chairs near the stove, and shelves holding her sparse belongings. It was clean and orderly, everything in its place, but Thomas's words echoed in her mind. Managing and thriving are different things. She'd been managing, surviving. Proving to the townspeople of Utica, to the neighboring ranchers who'd offered to buy her out, to everyone who'd said a woman alone couldn't make it, that she was strong enough. But had she been living, or just existing in this small circle of necessity? Fiona shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She had work to do. She pulled out flour and the sourdough starter she kept in a crock, beginning the familiar motions of making biscuits. She had salt pork from town, some dried beans she could soak and cook quickly, and coffee. Simple food, nothing fancy but honest and filling. As she worked, her mind kept drifting to the man in her barn. Thomas Wyatt. He spoke with education, she'd noticed, despite the rough clothes and the dust of the trail. His hands were calloused and capable, but there was a gentleness in how he'd touched his horse, how he'd greeted her dog. And those eyes, dark and direct but not aggressive, seeing more than she wanted them to see. The beans were bubbling on the stove when she heard the sound of hammer against wood. She moved to the window and saw Thomas up on the barn roof, his shirt off in the heat, working on the damaged section. His back was brown from the sun, muscles moving smoothly as he worked. Fiona felt something stir in her that she'd thought long dead or at least thoroughly suppressed. Want. Pure and simple and dangerous. She turned away from the window, her hands gripping the edge of the table. No. She'd built her life on not wanting, on not needing, on being entirely self-sufficient. A few words from a handsome drifter weren't going to change that. He'd be gone in 3 days, and her life would return to its predictable rhythms. But even as she thought it, she knew something had already shifted. The sun was touching the western mountains when Fiona carried a tray out to the barn. She'd loaded it with biscuits, beans, salt pork, and a tin cup of strong coffee. Thomas had climbed down from the roof and was washing up at the pump, working the handle with one hand while splashing water over his face and chest with the other. "Supper," Fiona called out, setting the tray on a barrel near the barn door. Thomas grabbed his shirt from where it hung on a fence post, shrugging it on but leaving it unbuttoned. He walked over, his hair still wet and curling at the ends. "Smells wonderful. Thank you, Miss Johnson." "It's plain food, nothing special." After 2 weeks of jerky and hardtack, plain food cooked fresh is a luxury. He picked up the plate, and she noticed again how his hands, despite their size and roughness, moved with care. The barn roof's patched sound. It should hold now. "I'll start on the fences in the morning if that suits." "The north fence first," Fiona said. That's where the cattle could wander off. Yes, madam. I saw the break when I rode in. I'll need to replace about 20 feet of post and wire. You have supplies, or should I ride into town? There's material in the shed behind the barn. My father stockpiled supplies before. She stopped, the familiar ache of loss pressing against her ribs. Thomas was quiet for a moment, respectful of her grief. He taught you well. Not many would keep a place running alone like you have. He didn't have much choice. My mother died when I was 12, and it was just the two of us after that. He taught me everything he knew because there was no one else to help. Fiona crossed her arms, defensive again. I didn't learn because I wanted to. I learned because I had to. Doesn't make the learning any less valuable. Thomas took a bite of biscuit, and his expression showed genuine appreciation. These are excellent. They're just biscuits. They're good biscuits. You don't need to diminish everything you do well. Fiona felt heat rise to her face again, but this time it wasn't anger. When had she started doing that? When had she begun treating everything she accomplished as just survival, nothing to be proud of? I should get back to the house, she said abruptly. Leave the dishes on the barrel. I'll collect them in the morning. Miss Johnson, Thomas's voice stopped her as she turned to go. Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger. I know it wasn't easy for you. She looked back at him, silhouetted against the darkening sky, and felt that crack in her defenses widen a little more. Just do the work you promised. That'll be thanks enough. But as she walked back to the cabin, Bear at her heels, she knew it wasn't the work that had her stomach fluttering and her thoughts scattered. It was the way he looked at her, like she was more than just a woman who'd become hard from necessity. Like he saw past the rifle and the defensive stance to something she'd almost forgotten existed. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Fiona stared at the ceiling and listened to the familiar sounds of her property. The horses shifting in the corral, an owl calling from the cottonwood by the creek, and underneath it all, the faint sound of someone moving in the barn. She imagined Thomas settling into his bedroll, his long body stretching out in the clean stall, his dark eyes closing in sleep. She rolled onto her side, angry at herself for the direction of her thoughts. 3 days, that's all she'd given him. 3 days to fix what needed fixing, and then he'd ride on to find work elsewhere. It was better that way. She didn't need complications. She didn't need anyone. But as sleep finally claimed her, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered Thomas's words back to her. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't doing it alone. The next morning, Fiona woke before dawn as always, pulled on her work clothes, and started coffee on the stove. She went through her routine mechanically, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, milking her one cow. By the time the sun was painting the eastern sky pink and gold, she saw Thomas already at work on the north fence, Bear supervising from a nearby patch of shade. She made breakfast, more out of habit than any agreement they'd made. Eggs, more biscuits, bacon from her small smokehouse, and coffee. She loaded it all onto the tray and walked out to where Thomas was digging a new post hole. He straightened when he saw her approaching, pulling off his work gloves. "Morning, Miss Johnson. Morning. Figured you'd need breakfast." She set the tray on a flat rock. "Can't work on an empty stomach." "That's kind of you." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The morning was already warming up, promising another hot August day. "I brought that old post out. The bottom was rotted clean through. It's a wonder it held as long as it did." Fiona looked at the fence line, seeing the work he'd already accomplished. 2 posts were already set and tamped solid, and he'd cleared away the overgrown brush that had been hiding the extent of the damage. "You work fast." "I work steady. That's different." Thomas accepted the plate she handed him. "Fast leads to mistakes. Steady gets the job done right." They stood in an oddly companionable silence while he ate. Fiona found herself watching the way his hands held the fork, the movement of his throat as he swallowed coffee. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the landscape instead. "Storm's coming," she said, nodding toward the western mountains where clouds were building. "We'll get rain by afternoon. Good for your garden." Thomas handed back the empty plate. "That fence line looks like it needed a good soaking anyway to help set these posts. You should finish what you can before the rain hits. Montana storms come up fast and hard. I'll keep that in mind." He pulled his gloves back on, and Fiona noticed how worn they were, the leather split across the knuckles. "Miss Johnson, can I ask you something?" She tensed immediately. "Depends on what you're asking. The folks in town, when I asked about work, they mentioned your place but then warned me off. Said you were a hard woman who didn't take kindly to help." His eyes met hers steadily. "But I don't see a hard woman. I see someone who's had to be strong because there was no other choice." Fiona felt her throat tighten. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough. I know you're out here alone, making it work through sheer determination. I know you're proud and you've earned the right to be. I know you've built walls to protect yourself, and I know those walls have cost you something." He took a step closer, and she fought the urge to back away. "What I'm asking is, why do you work so hard to convince everyone you don't need anybody? Because I don't." The words came out sharp, defensive. "I learned that lesson the hard way. People leave. They die, they move on, they let you down. The only person you can truly rely on is yourself. That's surviving, not living. Maybe surviving is enough." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze holding hers. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, almost tender. "No, it's not. Not for someone like you. You've got too much life in you to spend it just surviving." Fiona turned away, unable to bear the understanding in his eyes. "Finish the fence. That's what I'm paying you for, not philosophy." She walked back to the cabin without waiting for his response, the empty tray clutched in her hands. Inside, she set it down with more force than necessary, making the dishes rattle. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against the table, breathing hard. He'd been here less than a day, and already he was seeing too much, saying things that made her walls feel inadequate. She should send him away, tell him to take his repairs and his observations and move along. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't, because he was right, and that truth was both terrifying and somehow liberating. The morning passed with Fiona throwing herself into her own work. She weeded the garden with almost violent efficiency, mucked out the horse stalls, and started a batch of bread that she needed until her arms ached. All the while, she was aware of Thomas working on the fence, the steady rhythm of his hammer a counterpoint to her churning thoughts. The clouds moved in faster than she'd predicted, and by early afternoon, the sky had turned the greenish gray that promised a serious storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Fiona was in the barn, securing loose items before the storm hit, when Thomas appeared in the doorway. His shirt was soaked with sweat and rain that had started falling in large, scattered drops. "Fence is done," he announced. "All 20 feet replaced and secured. It'll hold now." "Good. Get inside before the storm really hits." She gestured to the barn's interior. "Lightning's dangerous out in the open." As if to punctuate her words, a brilliant flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the barn's frame. The rain suddenly intensified, going from scattered drops to a solid wall of water in seconds. Thomas ducked fully into the barn, closing the door against the driving rain. They stood in the dimness, listening to the storm rage outside. The horses in the corral whinnied nervously, but they had shelter in a 3-sided lean-to, and Fiona knew they'd be fine. "Montana storms don't fool around," Thomas said, moving to check on his horse in its stall. The animal was nervous, ears flat, and Thomas spoke to it in low, soothing tones until it calmed. Fiona watched him from across the barn, something softening in her chest. The way he handled animals, the patience and gentleness, spoke to character in a way that words never could. Another flash of lightning, another boom of thunder, and then a sharp cracking sound. Through the barn's side window, Fiona saw the old cottonwood by the creek split down the middle, half of it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks and broken branches. "That tree's been there since before I was born," she said quietly, feeling an unexpected grief at its loss. Thomas came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body in the cool, damp air. "Trees have their season, just like everything else. But look, half of it still stands. It'll keep growing." She turned to look at him and found his face closer than she'd expected. In the dim light, his eyes were very dark, his expression serious. "Why did you really come here?" she asked, the question pulled from some deep place she usually kept locked away. "There's better work, better pay elsewhere. Why take on repairs for a woman who made it clear she didn't want help?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. "Because when I rode up yesterday and saw you standing on that porch, rifle in hand, chin up, daring the world to take one more thing from you, I saw myself. I saw what I used to be before I learned that strength isn't the same as stubbornness, and independence isn't the same as isolation." He lifted one hand, and for a moment she thought he might touch her face, but he let it fall back to his side. "I saw someone worth knowing beyond all those walls." Fiona's breath caught in her throat. "You don't know me. Then let me. Let me be more than just the hired hand fixing your fences." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "You said you don't need anyone. Maybe that's true. But what about wanting? Is there room in all that independence for wanting?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Fiona's mind raced through all the reasons she should say no, should maintain her distance, should protect herself. But her heart, that part of her she'd worked so hard to silence, was beating a different rhythm. "I don't know how," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to want without needing, and needing has only ever brought pain." Thomas's hand came up again, and this time he did touch her, his fingertips brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "Then, let me teach you. Let me show you that wanting doesn't have to lead to pain. That letting someone in doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave." The storm raged around them, rain pounding on the roof, thunder shaking the walls, but in the small space between them, everything was still. Fiona felt something in her chest unlock, some carefully guarded place opening despite her fear. "3 days, she said, her voice shaking. "You said 3 days." "I said 3 days for the repairs. I didn't say anything about how long I'd stay if you asked me to." Thomas's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I'm not going anywhere you don't want me to go, Fiona. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't see you, really see you past all the armor you wear." Hearing her name on his lips, spoken with such care, undid something in her. Fiona leaned forward, closing the small distance between them, and Thomas met her halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, and the kiss deepened. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself this. So long since she'd let herself feel anything beyond the grim determination to survive another day. But Thomas's kiss was warmth and promise, and something that felt dangerously like hope. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. Tell me I didn't misread this. Tell me you feel it too." "I feel it," Fiona admitted, her voice rough. "And it terrifies me." "Good. That means it matters." His arms came around her solid and sure, and she let herself lean into his strength. "I'm not him, Fiona. I'm not whoever taught you that caring meant losing. My father didn't teach me that. Life did. He died and left me alone, but that wasn't his choice. It's just the way things are. People leave. Some people leave. Some people stay. You won't know which I am unless you give me the chance to prove it." The storm was beginning to ease, the thunder moving east, the rain settling into a steady rhythm. Fiona pulled back enough to look at Thomas's face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the openness of his expression. "Stay," she heard herself say, the word coming out before fear could stop it. "Not just 3 days, stay longer. There's plenty of work and I could use." She stopped, the old pride making it hard to continue. "Say it," Thomas urged gently. "Say what you need. I could use the help and maybe the company." She took a shaky breath. "But I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in. We'll figure it out together, one day at a time, one moment at a time." Thomas smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. "I'm a patient man, Fiona. I can go as slow as you need." She found herself smiling back, a real smile that felt strange on her face after so long. "You might regret saying that. I'm difficult on my best days. I like difficult. Easy gets boring." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "Besides, I think underneath all that difficult you're scared. And scared I can work with." The rain was tapering off now, the sun beginning to break through the clouds in shafts of golden light. Fiona stepped back, needing some space to think, to process what had just happened. She'd kissed a man she'd known for barely a day. She'd asked him to stay. She'd admitted to fear and loneliness she'd never acknowledged to anyone, barely even to herself. "I need to check the house, make sure the storm didn't cause any damage," she said, needing the familiar rhythm of work to ground her. "I'll come with you if you want." She almost refused automatically, but stopped herself. This was part of it, wasn't it? Part of learning to let someone in. "All right, yes, come with me." They walked through the rain-washed afternoon, their boots squelching in the mud. The house had weathered the storm fine, as had most of the property, though the fallen cottonwood would need to be dealt with eventually. Inside the cabin, everything was dry and secure. Fiona stood in the center of her small home, suddenly seeing it through Thomas's eyes. The sparse furnishings, the lack of any real comfort or decoration, it was functional, nothing more. A place to survive, not to live. "It's not much," she found herself saying. "It's a home, you've kept it well." Thomas looked around, his gaze taking in the carefully organized shelves, the clean floors, the small touches that spoke of someone who took pride in their space despite its simplicity. With some work, it could be even better. That corner would be perfect for a better stove, one with an oven for baking, and those windows could use real glass instead of the oiled paper. That takes money. That takes work and time. Money helps, but there are other ways. He turned to her. "If I stay on, I could help with more than just fence repairs. We could make improvements together, build this place into something more." The word "we" hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Fiona's first instinct was to reject it, to assert her independence, but she bit back the automatic response. She'd asked him to stay. She'd opened the door, however, slightly. Now she had to decide if she'd let him walk through it. "What do you want from this?" she asked bluntly. "From me?" "From staying here." Thomas considered the question seriously, not answering right away. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I want to build something. Not just a better cabin or stronger fences, but a life. A real life, with someone who understands that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. He met her eyes. "I want to know you, Fiona Johnson, the woman behind the rifle and the defensive stance. I want to wake up in the morning and have coffee with you. I want to work beside you during the day and sit with you in the evening and talk about nothing and everything." That sounds like courting. That's because it is courting. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I may be direct, but I believe in doing things proper. If I'm going to stay, if we're going to see what this might become, then let's do it right." Fiona felt panic flutter in her chest, but underneath it was something else, something that felt like excitement, like possibility. "I don't know how to be courted. I don't know how to be anything but what I am. What you are is exactly who I want to know." Thomas took a step closer but didn't crowd her. "No pretense, no playing at being someone you're not. Just you, Fiona, that's all I'm asking for." She looked at him. This man who'd ridden onto her property less than a day ago and somehow managed to see past defenses she'd spent years building. He was offering her something she'd convinced herself she didn't want, didn't need. But standing here in the aftermath of the storm, with the sun breaking through the clouds outside and hope breaking through her carefully maintained walls, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. She did want. God help her, she wanted so much it hurt. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, stay. We'll see what happens." Thomas's smile was like the sun coming out, bright and warm and full of promise. "Thank you, you won't regret it." "I might," Fiona said, but there was no heat in it. "But I'm willing to take the chance." The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Thomas moved from the barn to the small bunkhouse that had stood empty since her father died. He worked from dawn to dusk, repairing years of neglect that Fiona had been unable to address alone. But unlike the isolation of her previous existence, now she had company in her work. They fell into patterns without discussing them. Coffee together in the morning before the day's work began, sharing plans and dividing tasks. Meals eaten at the small table in the cabin, conversation flowing more easily as the days passed. Evenings spent on the porch, watching the sun set over the Montana mountains, Bear sprawled at their feet. Thomas was true to his word about courting. He moved slowly, respectfully, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. A hand on her shoulder as he passed. Help mounting her horse, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than necessary. Small gifts left where she'd find them. Wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, a new leather strap for her rifle, a book of poetry he'd picked up in town. It was the poetry that surprised her most. She found it on her bed one evening, a slim volume with worn covers. Inside, Thomas had marked certain pages with small pieces of paper. She read them alone by lamplight and found words that spoke of longing and connection and the courage it took to love. The next morning she thanked him, feeling awkward and unsure. Thomas just smiled and said, "Words matter. I thought you should know the ones I can't quite say yet." 2 weeks passed, then 3. The property transformed under their combined efforts. The fences stood strong and true. The barn roof was solid. Thomas had indeed improved the cabin, installing real glass windows he'd ordered from town and building a new stove that made the small space feel more like a real home. But more than the physical improvements, Fiona felt something in herself changing. The constant tension she'd carried for so long was easing. She laughed more, smiled more. She found herself seeking out Thomas's company, looking forward to the moments they spent together. The people of Utica noticed the changes. When Fiona went to town for supplies, the storekeeper commented on how well she looked, how some of the hardness had left her face. The banker, who'd been trying to buy her out for years, seemed surprised to see her looking prosperous instead of just surviving. "I hear you took on help," he said, his tone carrying a hint of disapproval. "A drifter, from what I understand." "Thomas Wyatt is his name, and he's no drifter," Fiona replied coolly. "He's a skilled worker and a good man. Still, a woman alone with a strange man, people will talk." "Let them talk. I've never much cared for gossip." But as she loaded her supplies and headed home, she felt the old familiar anxiety creeping back. Was she being foolish, trusting too quickly, setting herself up for the kind of pain she'd sworn to avoid? When she arrived back at the property, Thomas was working on a new corral extension, stripped to the waist in the afternoon heat. He saw her and waved, his smile genuine and glad. Bear ran to greet her, tail wagging, and Thomas followed more slowly, grabbing his shirt and pulling it on as he approached. "How was town?" "Same as always. People like to mind everyone's business but their own." She began unloading supplies, and Thomas moved to help her. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same bag, and the contact sent warmth through her. "They're talking about us," she said, not quite able to meet his eyes. "I expect they are. That bother you? It shouldn't." Fiona lifted a sack of flour, "But it makes me wonder if I'm being reckless. You've been here a month now, and I barely know you beyond what you've shown me." Thomas was quiet as they carried the supplies inside. When everything was stowed, he turned to her, his expression serious. "What do you want to know? Ask me anything." Fiona sat at the table, and after a moment, Thomas sat across from her. In the afternoon light filtering through the new windows, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin, the way his hair curled at his collar. "Tell me about Wyoming, about your family, about why you really left." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze going distant. "My father was a good man, hardworking and honest. He built our ranch from nothing, and when he died, I was 19 and certain I could do everything he did just as well." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was wrong. I was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to admit when I was in over my head. By the time I finally accepted that I couldn't do it alone, I'd run the place so far into debt there was no saving it. What happened? I sold out to pay what I owed. Took what little was left and started drifting, doing ranch work, learning from my mistakes." His eyes came back to her face. "I spent 3 years moving from place to place, telling myself I was looking for the right opportunity. But really, I was running from the shame of failing at the one thing that mattered most to my father. And then you came here. And then I came here." Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I saw your place, saw you standing there with that rifle, and something just clicked. I'd been looking for land, for property, for something to build on. But what I really needed was a reason to stay in one place, a reason to stop running. And I'm that reason." Fiona's voice was skeptical, protecting herself. "You could be, if you wanted to be." He reached across the table, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. "I'm not asking you to need me, Fiona. I'm not trying to take over or take control. I'm asking you to want me here, to choose to let me stay, not because you have to, but because you want to." Fiona looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and strong, offered in hope and vulnerability. She thought about the past month, about how her property had improved, yes, but more than that, how she'd felt lighter, happier, more alive than she had in 3 years. She placed her hand in his, feeling his fingers close gently around hers. "I do want you here. It scares me how much I want it. Being scared means it matters. That's not a bad thing." Thomas's thumb brushed over her knuckles. "I'm scared too, if it helps to know it. Scared I'll mess this up, scared I'll let you down, scared I'll prove not good enough. You could never be not good enough." The words came out fierce, surprising them both. Fiona felt her cheeks heat, but she didn't take the words back. Thomas's expression softened into something tender and wondering. He stood, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. They stood close in the small cabin, the air between them charged with possibility. "Fiona," he said her name like a prayer. "Can I kiss you?" Instead of answering, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was different from their first one in the barn during the storm. That had been surprise and discovery. This was choice and certainty, a conscious decision to let him in, to let herself feel. Thomas's arms came around her, pulling her close but not tight, always giving her room to pull away if she wanted. But Fiona didn't want to pull away. She wanted to lean in, to let herself be held, to accept the comfort and connection she'd denied herself for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you. I want you to know that. I'm not expecting you to say it back, not yet, but I need you to know where I stand." Fiona's heart hammered in her chest. The old fear rose up, screaming at her to protect herself, to push him away before he could hurt her. But she forced herself to stay present, to stay in this moment. "I don't know if I remember how to love," she admitted, "but I think I'm learning. With you, I think I'm learning. That's enough." "That's more than enough." He kissed her forehead, gentle and sweet. "We'll figure out the rest together." The summer moved into autumn, painting the Montana landscape in golds and reds. Thomas and Fiona worked side by side, bringing in the small harvest from her garden, preparing the property for winter, moving through the rhythms of ranch life as a team. They'd settled into an easy partnership, finishing each other's sentences, working in comfortable silence, learning each other's habits and preferences. Thomas had proven himself not just a skilled worker, but a thoughtful partner, always asking rather than assuming, always respecting the boundaries Fiona set. Those boundaries were slowly coming down. She'd invited him into the cabin more often, and they'd spend evenings sitting together, talking about their days, their hopes, their fears. She'd told him about her mother's death, about watching her father slowly give up after losing his wife, about her determination never to let anyone matter that much because the loss would destroy her. "But that's not really living, is it?" Thomas had said gently. "If you never let anyone matter, you never get hurt, but you also never get to experience joy, real joy, the kind that comes from connection. And what if the joy isn't worth the eventual pain? What if it is? What if having someone to share your life with, even knowing it might end, is better than being safe and alone?" She hadn't had an answer then, but the question stayed with her, working its way through her defenses like water through stone. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "There's something I want to ask you, but I don't want you to feel pressured." Fiona felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. "What is it?" "The people in town. They're going to keep talking as long as I'm living in the bunkhouse and you're in the cabin. It doesn't bother me, but I don't want it to damage your reputation." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I want to do right by you, Fiona. I want to marry you if you'll have me." The word marry seemed to echo in the evening air. Fiona felt panic rising, sharp and familiar. Marriage meant commitment, permanence, vulnerability. It meant giving someone the power to hurt her in ways she might never recover from. "I can't," she said, standing abruptly. "Thomas, I can't." He stood too, but didn't reach for her. "Can't or won't, does it matter? It might." His voice was steady, patient. "If it's can't because you don't care for me, then I'll respect that and move on. But if it's can't because you're scared, that's different. Of course I'm scared." Fiona wrapped her arms around herself. "You're asking me to trust that you'll stay, that you won't leave me alone again, and I don't know if I can do that. I'm not asking for blind trust. I'm asking you to take a chance on us, on what we've built here." Thomas took a step closer. Look at what we've done together in these few months. Look at how good we are together. Why can't you let yourself believe that might continue, because everyone leaves? The words burst out of her, raw and painful. My mother died. My father died. Even the ranch hands we used to have, they'd work a season and move on. Everyone leaves, Thomas. Why would you be different? Because I love you. He said it simply, certainly. Because I've been running for 3 years looking for a place to belong, and I found it here with you. Because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is seeing your face. Because you make me want to be better, do better, build something that lasts. Tears were streaming down Fiona's face now, hot and unexpected. What if it's not enough? What if loving each other isn't enough to keep you from leaving or dying or just deciding one day that I'm too difficult, too damaged, too much work? Thomas closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have had this time together. Don't you see, Fiona? You're so afraid of the pain of losing someone that you're choosing the pain of loneliness instead. But that pain never ends. At least with love, there's joy mixed in with the risk. She looked up at him, this man who'd somehow seen past all her defenses to the frightened, lonely woman underneath. He was offering her everything she'd told herself she didn't want, and her heart was screaming yes even as her mind insisted on caution. I don't know how to be a wife. I don't know how to be anything but independent and self-sufficient. Then we'll figure it out together. Thomas leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her cheeks, then finally her lips. Say yes, Fiona. Say yes to us, to building a life together, to taking this chance. She kissed him back, tasting salt from her tears and something sweet like hope. When she pulled back, she took a shaky breath. I need time. I'm not saying no, but I need time to think, to be sure. Thomas nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That night, Fiona lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with her fears. Part of her wanted to run out to the bunkhouse, wake Thomas up, and say yes to everything he was offering. But the larger part, the part that had been hurt and learned to survive by not needing anyone, held her back. She thought about the past few months, about how much better her life had become with Thomas in it. Not because he'd fixed things she couldn't fix herself, but because he'd made the work lighter, the days brighter, the loneliness less acute. He'd made her laugh. He'd made her feel seen and valued in ways she'd forgotten were possible. But was that love? Or just the relief of no longer being alone? The answer came to her as the sun rose, painting her cabin in soft morning light. She knew it was love because the thought of Thomas leaving hurt worse than the thought of him staying and potentially leaving later. She knew it was love because she wanted to see him first thing in the morning and last thing at night. She knew it was love because when she imagined her future now, he was in it, and the picture was so much richer and fuller than anything she'd envisioned when she was alone. She dressed quickly and walked out to the bunkhouse before she could second-guess herself. Thomas was already up, standing by the small window, a cup of coffee in his hands. He turned when she entered, hope and caution warring in his expression. Fiona. Yes, she said, the word coming out firm and sure. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to building a life together. Yes to taking the chance. The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunrise. He set down his coffee and crossed to her in 3 long strides, sweeping her up in his arms and spinning her around. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, thoroughly, a kiss full of promise and passion and joy. You won't regret it, he said when they finally broke apart. I swear to you, Fiona, I will spend every day proving you made the right choice. Just don't make me regret wearing my heart on my sleeve. She said it lightly, but he heard the real fear underneath. Your heart is safe with me. I'll guard it with my life." Thomas took her hand, bringing it to his lips. When? When can we get married? Soon, before I lose my nerve." Fiona laughed shakily. "Before winter sets in and we're snowed in here together without making it proper. This week, then. We'll go into town tomorrow, get the license, talk to the preacher. We can have a simple ceremony, just us and whatever witnesses we need. No fuss, no big party. No fuss," Thomas agreed. "Just the two of us making promises we intend to keep." They went to Utica the next day, riding in together on Thomas's horse with Fiona seated in front of him, his arms around her waist. It felt strange and wonderful to be held like that, to lean back against his chest and feel safe and cherished. The town was surprised by their announcement but not scandalized. The preacher agreed to perform the ceremony on Saturday, 3 days away. They filed the necessary papers with the county clerk, bought a simple gold band from the general store, and made arrangements for supplies they'd need to see them through the winter. The storekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, a kind woman who'd always treated Fiona fairly, pulled her aside while Thomas was loading supplies. "I'm glad for you, dear," she said quietly. "You've been alone too long, and that young man looks at you like you hung the moon. Don't let fear rob you of happiness." Fiona felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm terrified I'm making a mistake." "Of course you are. That's how you know it matters." Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. "But I've watched him in town these past months. He's steady, that one. And he looks at you like you're the answer to every question he ever had." On Saturday, they stood in the small church in Utica with Mrs. Peterson and the store clerk as witnesses. Fiona wore a simple blue dress she'd bought for the occasion, and Thomas wore his best shirt and pants, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes serious as the preacher began the ceremony. The words washed over her in a blur of nerves and emotion. "Love, honor, cherish in sickness and health, until death do us part." Big words, heavy promises, the kind she'd sworn she'd never make. But when it came time for her to speak her vows, she looked into Thomas's eyes and saw such love and certainty there that her fear quieted. She said the words clearly, firmly, meaning every one. Thomas's voice was rough with emotion as he spoke his vows, his hands holding hers gently but securely. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak and her heart sore. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Fiona felt different, lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. At the property line, Thomas reined in his horse. "I want to carry you over the threshold if you'll allow it, start this marriage proper." Fiona laughed, feeling giddy and young and foolish in the best way. "That's ridiculous. We've both been living here for months. Humor me. I want to do at least one thing traditionally." So when they reached the cabin, Thomas dismounted and lifted her down, then scooped her up into his arms and carried her through the door. Inside, he set her down gently, his hands lingering at her waist. "Mrs. Wyatt," he said, testing out her new name, Fiona Wyatt. She tried it too, feeling how strange and right it sounded. "I might keep Johnson for working purposes. I've built a reputation under that name. You can keep whatever name you want as long as you keep me too." Thomas pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I love you, Fiona. However you want to be called, whatever you want to keep or change, I love you. I love you too." The words came easier than she'd expected, natural and true. "I think I've loved you since you first offered to fix my fences and looked at me like I was strong instead of broken." That night, they moved Thomas's belongings from the bunkhouse to the cabin, combining their lives in tangible ways. The small space felt crowded but cozy with two people's things filling it. They made love for the first time as husband and wife, slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies with care and wonder. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Thomas's arms around her and his heartbeat steady under her ear, Fiona felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not just the absence of struggle, but the positive presence of contentment, of being exactly where she was meant to be. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what? For not giving up on me, for seeing past the walls to who I really was." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for letting me in, for being brave enough to risk your heart again." It didn't feel brave. It felt terrifying. That's what brave is, being terrified and doing it anyway. He kissed the top of her head. "Now sleep, wife. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Work, building a life together, that's not something that happens overnight. It takes time and effort and patience. "But I figure we've got plenty of all three." Fiona smiled into the darkness, letting her eyes close. For the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep not bracing for the next challenge, but looking forward to the next day. The winter came hard and early that year, with snow falling in late October and temperatures dropping well below freezing. But the cabin was snug and tight, the barn was solid, and the animals were well sheltered. Thomas and Fiona worked together to keep everything running, falling into rhythms that felt like they'd been doing this together for years instead of months. They spent the long winter evenings talking, planning for spring, dreaming about the future. Thomas wanted to expand the herd, maybe add some horses to breed and sell. Fiona wanted to enlarge the garden, maybe start selling vegetables in town. Together, they sketched out plans for improvements, for building something lasting. But more than the practical planning, they learned each other in the intimate ways of married life. Thomas learned that Fiona was grumpy before her first cup of coffee, that she hummed while she worked, that she had nightmares sometimes about being alone and needed to be held until they passed. Fiona learned that Thomas was an early riser who loved watching the sunrise, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise, that he was ticklish along his ribs in a way that made him laugh like a boy. They had their first fight in December, a stupid argument about whether to butcher one of the steers or try to keep it through winter. It escalated quickly, both of them stubborn and sure they were right. Fiona said something sharp about not needing Thomas to make decisions for her, and he responded that he wasn't trying to take over, he was trying to be a partner. The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. Fiona turned to storm out, the old instinct to isolate herself when things got difficult rising up strong. But Thomas caught her arm, not roughly but firmly. "Don't," he said. "Don't run away when things get hard. That's what you did before, isn't it? When things got difficult, you built walls and pushed people away. But I'm your husband now, and I'm not going away just because we disagree. Let go of me." Her voice was cold, defensive. "Not until you promise we'll talk this through. Not until you promise you won't shut me out." Fiona wanted to yank her arm free to prove she didn't need him or his demands. But something in his eyes, some combination of frustration and fear and love, stopped her. "Fine. We'll talk." They sat at the table and slowly, painfully, worked through the disagreement. It turned out Thomas wasn't trying to make decisions for her. He was worried about their resources and trying to plan ahead. And Fiona wasn't rejecting his input. She was afraid of losing her autonomy, of becoming dependent on someone else's judgment. "I don't want to lose myself in this marriage," she admitted finally. "I don't want to become someone who can't function without you. And I don't want you to. I fell in love with a strong, independent woman, but independence and partnership aren't opposites, Fiona. You can be strong and still let me help. You can be capable and still ask for input. That's not weakness, it's wisdom." The fight ended with both of them apologizing, holding each other close, promising to communicate better. And in the aftermath, Fiona felt something shift. They'd had a conflict and survived it. Thomas hadn't left or shut down or tried to punish her. He'd stood his ground and insisted they work through it together. Maybe, she thought, this might actually work. Maybe love didn't have to mean losing yourself. Maybe it could mean finding yourself more fully in partnership with someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. Christmas came, their first together. They didn't have much, but Thomas surprised Fiona with a beautiful leather-bound journal and a set of writing pens. "For your thoughts," he said. "I know you keep things inside, but maybe writing them down would help, and someday maybe our children would like to know what their mother was thinking and feeling." Fiona felt her throat tighten. "Children, if you want them, if we're blessed that way." Thomas looked uncertain for the first time in months. "We've never talked about it. I shouldn't have assumed." "No, I want them. I do." Fiona hadn't let herself think about children in years, but suddenly the image was there. A little boy with Thomas's dark eyes, a little girl with her determination. A family. "But I'm scared I won't be a good mother. I'm not exactly soft and nurturing." "You're strong and capable and loyal. Those are pretty good qualities for a mother." Thomas pulled her into his arms. "And you won't be doing it alone. We'll figure it out together, just like everything else." Fiona gave Thomas a new saddle she'd ordered months ago with money she'd saved, keeping it hidden in the barn. His old one was worn nearly through, and she'd noticed him checking it worriedly, trying to decide if he could make it last another year. "Fiona, this is too much," he protested, but his eyes were bright with pleasure. "It's practical. You need a good saddle." But she smiled, pleased to have surprised him. They spent Christmas Day snowed in, making love by the fire, eating a special meal of preserved ham and dried apple pie, talking about the future with hope instead of fear. It was the best Christmas Fiona had ever had. The new year came, 1882 arriving with bitter cold and heavy snows. But by February, there were signs of spring coming. Longer days, the occasional warm wind from the south, the restlessness of the animals sensing change in the air. And Fiona sensed change too in her own body. She'd missed her monthly courses twice now, and she felt different, tender and tired and somehow more alive. She'd been trying to convince herself it was just the hard winter, the close quarters stress. But as February turned to March and she still didn't bleed, she had to face the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. A baby. A child. Someone else to love and protect and inevitably lose. The old fear rose up, threatening to swallow her whole. She didn't tell Thomas right away. She needed time to process it herself, to figure out how she felt, to shore up her defenses against the vulnerability that came with loving someone so small and helpless. But Thomas noticed something was different. He'd become attuned to her moods over the winter, learning to read her silences and her tensions. "What's wrong?" he asked one evening as they sat together after supper. "You've been distant the past few days." "Nothing's wrong, Fiona." He turned her to face him. "We promised we'd talk to each other. What's going on?" She took a breath, then blurted it out before fear could stop her. "I'm pregnant. I think I'm about 3 months along." Thomas's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, concern. "A baby. We're having a baby." "It seems that way." "That's wonderful." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Fiona, that's amazing. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I'm terrified." The admission came out small and scared. "Thomas, what if something happens? What if I lose the baby, or what if childbirth?" "Women die in childbirth. My mother did." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Your mother died having you." "No, she died having my brother. He died too. I was 12, and I watched my father lose them both and nearly go mad with grief." Fiona pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't want to leave you like that, and I don't want to love this baby only to lose it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him processing, thinking. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I understand you're scared. What happened to your mother was tragic. But Fiona, you're strong and healthy. We'll get the doctor from town to help when the time comes. We'll do everything we can to keep you and the baby safe. You can't promise that. You can't control what happens." "No, I can't. But I can promise that whatever happens, we'll face it together. And I can promise that loving this baby, even if the worst happens, will be worth it. Just like loving you is worth the risk of losing you." Fiona felt tears start to fall, all the fear and hope and overwhelming emotion of the past weeks spilling out. Thomas held her while she cried, not trying to fix it or minimize her fears, just being there, solid and steady. When the storm passed, she felt lighter. The fear was still there, but it wasn't paralyzing anymore. She could feel it and feel the joy too, both existing together. "We're really having a baby," she said, and this time her voice held wonder instead of fear. "We really are." Thomas placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "A little person, half you and half me. I can't wait to meet them. I hope they have your patience and kindness. I hope they have your strength and determination." He kissed her forehead. "And I hope they have your eyes, that particular color of green-gray that changes with your mood. That's very specific. I notice things about you, everything about you." Thomas smiled. "Like how you bite your bottom lip when you're concentrating, and how you hum old hymns when you're content, and how you always check the rifle by the door 3 times before bed. Someone has to be vigilant, and someone has to notice the little things that make you who you are." He pulled her close again. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for trusting me with your fears. I'm still learning how to do that, to trust. I know, and I'm honored that you're trying." Spring came in earnest, the snow melting to reveal brown earth that would soon turn green. Thomas and Fiona worked together to prepare for the busy season ahead, but now everything had an added layer of urgency. They needed to get as much done as possible before the baby came in October. Thomas was fiercely protective, trying to keep Fiona from heavy work. She chafed at the restrictions at first, insisting she was pregnant, not incapable. They found a compromise. She'd do the lighter tasks and let him handle anything that involved heavy lifting or climbing. As her belly grew through the summer months, Fiona found herself softening in ways that surprised her. She caught herself daydreaming about the baby, imagining tiny hands and feet, wondering if it would be a boy or girl, planning how they'd rearrange the cabin to make room for a cradle. Thomas built that cradle himself, working on it in the evenings after the day's work was done. It was beautiful, smooth wood carefully sanded and fitted together, with delicate carvings of horses and mountains along the sides. "It's perfect," Fiona said when he showed it to her, tears in her eyes. "Thomas, it's beautiful, for our beautiful baby." He placed his hand on her swollen stomach, and they felt the baby kick in response. The look of wonder on his face made her love him even more. The baby came on a cold night in late October, 3 weeks earlier than the doctor had predicted. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Fiona's worst fears seemed like they might come true. But Thomas was there, holding her hand, wiping her face, speaking words of encouragement and love. And finally, after 18 hours of struggle, their son was born, screaming his displeasure at being forced into the cold world. The doctor placed him in Fiona's arms, and she looked down at his red face and dark hair, his tiny perfect fingers, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello." Thomas was crying openly, his hand touching the baby's head with infinite gentleness. "He's perfect. Fiona, he's perfect." They named him William Thomas Wyatt after both their fathers, Billy for short. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's dark eyes and what promised to be his mother's stubborn determination. The first few months were exhausting, a blur of sleepless nights and constant demands. But they navigated it together, Thomas getting up with her for nighttime feedings, both of them marveling at every small change and development. Fiona discovered that she was a good mother, despite her fears. Her strength translated into patience, her determination into devotion. And watching Thomas with their son, seeing the tenderness and joy on his face, made her fall in love with him all over again. "You were right," she told him one night as they sat together, Billy asleep in the cradle between them. "About everything. About love being worth the risk. About it being better to try than to stay safe and alone." "I'm always right," Thomas teased, then laughed when she swatted his arm. "But in all seriousness, thank you for trusting me. Thank you for being brave enough to build this life with me. I'm still scared sometimes. Scared something will happen to you or Billy. Scared I'll lose what we've built. That's normal. That's love. But now you know you can survive the fear and still live fully." He reached for her hand. "And you know you don't have to face it alone." The years passed, each one building on the last. The ranch prospered under their joint care. They added to their herd, built a larger barn, expanded the cabin into a proper house with separate bedrooms and a real kitchen. Billy grew into a sturdy, happy child with his mother's eyes and his father's gentle nature. When he was 3, Fiona gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Fiona Wyatt. She had Thomas's dark hair and a fierce temperament that made them both laugh even as they struggled to keep up with her. 2 years after Sarah came another son, James, quiet and thoughtful, content to watch the world around him with serious eyes. The cabin that had once held only Fiona's loneliness now rang with children's laughter and the busy noise of family life. The property that she'd struggled to maintain alone was now a thriving ranch, known throughout the territory for quality cattle and well-trained horses. But more than the material success, Fiona had built something she'd never thought possible: a family. A life full of love and connection, and the beautiful, terrifying vulnerability of caring deeply for other people. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised her with a trip to the same church in Utica where they'd married. Mrs. Peterson, now gray-haired and slower-moving but still sharp as ever, had organized a celebration with many of the townspeople who'd watched their unlikely courtship and successful marriage. "I wanted to tell you in front of witnesses," Thomas said, holding her hands in the church that had seen their vows, "that these 10 years with you have been the best of my life. You taught me that strength comes in many forms and that loving someone doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave." Fiona looked at this man who'd ridden onto her property 11 years ago and refused to accept her walls. He'd kept every promise he'd made. He'd stayed through the hard times and the good times, through fears and joys, through ordinary days and extraordinary ones. "You taught me something too," she said, her voice carrying clear in the small church. "You taught me that needing someone and wanting someone are different things, that I could be strong and independent and still build a life with a partner. That love doesn't diminish you, it completes you." She thought back to that day on the porch, when she'd stood with her rifle and her pride and her determination to need no one. She remembered Thomas's words, the ones that had started everything. "Then let me be your want." He had become that and so much more. Her want, her choice, her partner, her love. The children grew as children do. Billy inherited the ranch, working it alongside his father and eventually bringing home a wife of his own. Sarah, true to her fierce nature, became a schoolteacher in Utica, educating the next generation. James, the quiet one, showed an unexpected talent with horses and built a breeding program that became renowned throughout Montana. Thomas and Fiona grew older together, their bodies showing the marks of hard work and long years, but their love only deepening with time. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, in rocking chairs Thomas had built, watching the sun set over land they'd built into something lasting. "You ever regret it?" Fiona asked one evening when they were both in their 60s. "Staying here instead of finding something easier?" Thomas reached for her hand, his fingers still fitting perfectly around hers despite the years. "Not once, not for a single moment." Fiona thought about the scared, lonely woman she'd been, so determined to prove she didn't need anyone. She thought about the life she might have had if she'd sent Thomas away that first day, if she'd clung to her walls and her isolation. It would have been safer, maybe, but it would have been so much emptier. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude. You gave me a life I didn't know I wanted, and it turned out to be everything I needed. You gave me a home, not just a place, but a reason to stay, a reason to build and grow and hope." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I love you, Fiona. I've loved you since the day I saw you standing on that porch with your rifle and your pride, daring the world to try you. And I love you, even though it terrified me, especially because it terrified me." She smiled, feeling the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, earned from years of smiling more than frowning. "You were right, about bravery. The bravest thing I ever did was let you in." As the sun set on another day, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, they sat together in comfortable silence. Around them was the life they'd built, the house, the barn, the corrals, the land they'd worked and loved. But more than the physical things, there was the legacy of love they'd created, passed down to their children and grandchildren. Fiona thought about the young woman she'd been, so certain that independence meant isolation, that strength meant going it alone. She told Thomas she needed no one, and he'd offered to be her want instead. In accepting that offer, in choosing one over need, love over fear, she discovered that the bravest and strongest thing she could do was let herself be vulnerable enough to love and be loved. It had been scary. It had been hard, but it had been worth every moment of fear, every risk, every leap of faith, because in the end she hadn't lost herself in loving Thomas and their family. She'd found herself more fully than she ever had alone. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and steady. Fiona squeezed Thomas's hand, and he squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was everything. Communication, connection, love, trust, partnership, home. She'd needed no one, she'd insisted all those years ago. But she'd wanted him, chosen him, loved him. And in that choosing, she'd found not just a husband or a partner, but herself, whole and complete and fully alive at last. Thomas pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Their children were grown and gone to their own lives, but they'd be back for Sunday dinner, bringing grandchildren and stories and laughter. "I'm glad you were stubborn," Fiona said suddenly. "That first day when I told you to leave, I'm glad you pushed back. I knew you were worth pushing back for. I saw past the rifle to the woman holding it." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes the people who push others away the hardest are the ones who most need someone to stay. Is that what you did? Stayed when I pushed you away? I didn't just stay. I showed you that staying was possible, that not everyone leaves. And slowly you started to believe it. It was true." He'd proven through actions, not just words, that love didn't have to mean loss, that commitment could be kept, that promises could be trusted. And in proving those things, he'd healed wounds she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten they were wounds and not just part of who she was. The stars were coming out now, scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on velvet. Fiona remembered nights she'd sat on this porch alone, looking at those same stars and feeling small and isolated. Now, with Thomas beside her and the knowledge of their family all around, she looked at the stars and felt connected to something larger and more beautiful than loneliness could ever comprehend. "You think Billy and his wife will give us more grandchildren?" Thomas asked, a smile in his voice. "Probably. Sarah's hinting that she and her husband are trying too, and James will surprise us one of these days. He always does things in his own time. We made good children, strong and capable and kind. We did." Fiona felt pride swell in her chest. "They know how to work hard and love harder. That's a good legacy. The best legacy." Thomas shifted in his rocking chair, his joints protesting the movement. They were both getting older, slower, feeling the years in their bones, but their minds were still sharp, their love still strong. "Thomas." "Yes, when the time comes, when one of us." She couldn't finish the sentence, the old fear still lingering after all these years. He understood anyway. "When that time comes, we'll face it like we've faced everything else. Together, for as long as we can. And whoever is left will go on, carrying the other in their heart. Because that's what love means. It doesn't end just because the person is gone." Fiona nodded, tears pricking her eyes. She'd spent so much of her early life afraid of that inevitable loss. But now, she understood that loving fully, completely, without holding back, meant accepting that loss would come eventually. And she'd rather have had all these years with Thomas, even knowing she'd lose him someday, than have missed out on this life because she was too afraid to risk her heart. "I hope I go first," she admitted quietly. "I don't want to be without you. And I hope you outlive me by decades, surrounded by children and grandchildren, happy and loved." Thomas squeezed her hand. "But we don't get to choose. We just get to make the most of the time we have." They sat in silence for a while longer, until the night air grew too cold for old bones, and they went inside to the warmth of their home. The fire in the stone fireplace Thomas had built years ago crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Fiona made tea while Thomas added wood to the fire. They moved around each other with the ease of long practice, anticipating needs and movements without speaking. This was love too, she thought. Not just the grand gestures and passionate moments, but the quiet comfort of shared routines, of being so familiar with someone that you moved as one. They settled into their chairs by the fire, tea warming their hands, the soft light playing across their weathered faces. Outside, the wind picked up, a reminder that winter would come soon. But they were prepared. They'd weathered many winters together and would weather more. "Tell me a story," Fiona said, as she often did on these quiet evenings. "Tell me about the first time you saw me." Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. He'd told her this story 100 times, but she never tired of hearing it. "I came over that rise and saw the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. A woman standing on a porch, rifle in hand, daring the world to come closer. The sun was behind her, turning her hair to fire, and even from a distance I could see the set of her jaw, the stiffness of her spine. Pride and pain all mixed together. I wasn't beautiful. I was dusty and tired and defensive. You were magnificent. You looked like you'd fight off an army single-handed if necessary. And I thought, there's a woman worth knowing. There's a woman who survived something and come out stronger for it. You thought all that from a distance. I thought enough to know I wanted to meet you. And then you spoke, telling me to stay away, and your voice was strong, but underneath it I heard loneliness. I recognized it because I'd been lonely too, wandering and searching for something I couldn't name. Fiona reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "And you found it here." "I found everything here. Home, purpose, love, family. I found myself." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "But most of all, I found you, the woman behind the walls, the heart beneath the armor. That was worth staying for. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you were stubborn enough to push past my defenses. I'm glad you were brave enough to let me in eventually." Thomas's voice grew softer, more reflective. "Do you remember what you said? When I told you I wanted to be your want, I said I didn't know how to want without needing. And I said I'd teach you. I'd show you that wanting someone by choice was different from needing them from desperation." He looked at her intently. Did I manage to show you that?" Fiona thought about it, really considered the question. She thought about the difference between the scared, isolated woman she'd been and the woman she was now, loved and loving, part of a family, connected to others without losing herself. "You did. You showed me that I could choose to share my life without giving up my identity. That I could be strong and vulnerable at the same time. That love and independence weren't opposites but could exist together, making both stronger." "Good." Thomas looked satisfied, content. "Then I did what I set out to do all those years ago." They finished their tea as the fire burned down to embers. Eventually, they made their way to their bedroom, the room they'd shared for over a decade, through seasons and years and all the moments that made up a life. As they settled into bed, Fiona curled into Thomas's side as naturally as breathing. His arm came around her, holding her close, and she felt safe and cherished and home. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too. Always have, always will." Sleep came easily, as it always did these days. The anxieties of youth had been replaced by the peace of a life well lived, of knowing that whatever time they had left, they'd spend it together, surrounded by the love they'd built. The years continued to pass, gentler now. Thomas and Fiona's pace slowed, but their days remained full. Grandchildren visited often, filling the house with noise and energy. The ranch continued to prosper under Billy's management, with Thomas offering advice when asked but trusting his son to make his own decisions. They celebrated more anniversaries, each one a milestone and a blessing. 15 years, 20 years, 25 years of marriage. Each celebration was quieter than the last but no less meaningful. What mattered wasn't the grand gestures but the simple fact of still being together, still choosing each other day after day. When Thomas was 72 and Fiona was 70, they decided to take a trip back to Wyoming, to see the land where Thomas had grown up. It was a journey of nostalgia and closure, visiting the place he'd left so long ago, when grief and failure had driven him north. The ranch where he'd grown up was now owned by someone else, but the new owners welcomed them kindly, letting Thomas show Fiona the barn where he'd learned to work horses, the field where he'd helped his father plant crops, the hill where his parents were buried. They stood at those graves together, and Thomas spoke quietly about his parents, about the lessons they'd taught him, about the guilt he'd carried for so long about losing the ranch. "But I found something better," he said, his arm around Fiona's waist. "I found a new start, a new home, a new life." "They would have been happy for me. They would have been proud of you," Fiona added. "You built something lasting. You honored their memory by learning from your mistakes and building a good life." They returned to Montana renewed, ready to enjoy whatever time remained. And there was still more time than they expected. Thomas lived to be 78, and Fiona lived to be 76. They passed within 6 months of each other, Thomas going peacefully in his sleep one winter night, and Fiona following in the spring, her heart finally giving out as she sat on the porch watching the sun rise over land they'd loved together. Their children buried them side by side on the hill behind the house, near where Fiona's father rested, under the vast Montana sky they'd both loved. The headstone was simple but said everything that mattered: Thomas and Fiona Wyatt, together in life, together in death, beloved. The ranch continued through their children and grandchildren, the house they'd built still standing strong. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, those who lived there said they could feel a presence, a sense of peace and love that lingered in the wood and stone, in the land itself. It was the legacy of two people who'd learned that strength wasn't in isolation but in connection. That the bravest thing wasn't doing it alone but opening your heart to love, despite the risks. That wanting and choosing were different from needing and depending, and that the choice to love was the most powerful choice of all. Fiona had said she needed no one, protecting her heart with walls of pride and fear. And Thomas had replied, "Then let me be your want." In that simple exchange had been the seed of everything that followed. A courtship, a marriage, a family, a life built on choice and love and the daily decision to face the world together instead of alone. It was a good life, a full life, a life that mattered. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. Not to avoid pain or loss, but to live fully despite them. Not to protect your heart at all costs, but to risk it for something worth having. Not to need someone out of weakness, but to want them out of strength, and to choose them again and again, through all the seasons of life. That was the story of Fiona and Thomas Wyatt, of a woman who thought she needed no one and the cowboy who taught her that wanting was enough. That choice was stronger than need, and that love, when freely given and gratefully received, was the greatest adventure of all.